we can't not talk about the war. Obviously, the podcast is called Upside. It is about European venture, but we can't not talk about the war. It's horrific. It's, we're not going to go into the human side, but obviously our hearts are in that. But parking the human tragedy, we've got to go into it. And the economic impact could be massive. This will ripple all the way down to what we're doing and who we're serving and the markets that our founders are dealing with. And I didn't realize until this conflict or this part of the conflict started how important the Strait of Hormuz is for global trade. It's not just oil or gas, although oil is about 20% of global consumption. It's also fertilizers, it's chemicals, it's aluminium, it's jet fuel, grain, and all of these very important commodities come through that tiny, tiny strait. On top of all the standard stuff that goes to and fro. Obviously, the Gulf is a big importer of luxury goods from Europe. So there's the standard stuff that goes through that strait, that tiny bottleneck just between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I think, and in whatever Qatar and those other places all the way up to Kuwait. And last week, tanker throughput dropped to 95%, which then instigated Trump to guarantee transit. So the big brush context here is energy, if it goes up, inflation up, interest rates up, investment down, money recycling down, all bad news for us. As an incidental, one aspect that I didn't quite consider is that getting crude prices up is actually good for Russia. So the second order effects of this challenge in the region on Ukraine could be quite high. And another unfun fact before we kick off, about 33% of the world's fertilizers come through that tiny, tiny little strait. Lots to unpack. Try and pair it back to Europe, startups, venture investing, and all that good stuff. And Mads, maybe if I can kick off with you, starting with the UK, how does this kind of roll through to us?
Well, I think the big context here is what it says about Europe and the UK and our place in the world. There's been lots of discussion about whether the UK should have participated in the strikes and what role the UK should have taken, being a close ally of the US, being a close ally of the Gulf countries, etc. And I think, you could probably say maybe a bit of skepticism in terms of participation was warranted. The US didn't exactly get things right in Iraq. And so maybe there's a bit of once bitten, twice shy and all that stuff. That said, it does feel like we're a little bit on the sidelines right now. The truth is, the UK economy was already weak before the first missile hit. The UK OBR, kind of the group that forecasts and kind of checks to try to say, what is really the fiscal situation of the UK, the PLC, the UK economy, cut growth forecast to 1.1%, and that was before the war started. Unemployment is high, taxes heading for historic highs. So that picture is not exactly looking good. From a European perspective, we've got issues around having enough energy reserves, especially around gas. The European gas storage is down to very low levels, 46 billion cubic meters. It was 60 last year, 77 the year before. So we've been running the stores down, sort of 2 consecutive years of drawdowns here. And then, as you say, a lot of the fuels and a lot of the things we need are transiting through the Straits of Hormuz. So lots of impacts that could sort of impact us negatively. Now, that said, balance, and here's your upside, Dan. I actually think this crisis might be shorter than many people think. Already a couple of days ago, we started looking at the missile launch rate out of Iran, and that's been decaying at a very, very rapid rate. You sort of had 350 ballistic missiles on the first day, but only 50 on day 4. And the reason it's declining so fast is because all the launch capabilities, all the launchers are being destroyed very rapidly. And then you could say, okay, what's left? They're the drones. They're much easier to deal with. They're much slower. They have lower impact. And so that potentially means that the problem, the crisis could be contained, and therefore that things could sort of go back to normal, if you will, more quickly than worst case scenario right now. On the other hand, a lot of the proxy network that Iran had built up around the region has already been destroyed. Assad has fallen. So there is an upside scenario potentially here that the crisis can be contained. You can get a better regime in Iran, and maybe we can all sort of peace can break out, and we can all sing Kumbaya. So here's to hoping.
But I can't quite work out what the Americans' aim is. Is it regime change? Is that the goal? it's never been done by the air before. So I'm kind of just,
No, I think it's very. So I think Trump. He's very transactional. I mean, I think they've sort of said early on. Look, there are three things the Iranians need to stop doing. They need to stop sponsoring terrorist networks. They need to stop. They need to stop developing the nuclear missile capabilities, and they need to stop developing these. So the nukes and also the missile launch capabilities to threaten the region. And actually, I think if the regime at some point gets to feel enough pain, there might be somebody there that says, look, we can agree to those three things. We're going to stop, in which case I think Trump's going to stop. And I think this could possibly blow over. You saw in Venezuela, he was relatively pragmatic, right? They got Maduro and kind of let the rest of the regime move on. That may not be what Iranians in exile are looking for. They might be looking for something more radical, but I'm not sure he is going to push as hard for regime change as some people think or would like. So this is just a speculation.
Yeah, but if they don't, then it feels like this is just going to be there'll be another cycle in another period of time. So I don't know. I obviously the region is extremely
No,
difficult
you say
and troubled.
that. You say that. I mean, Khamenei, he had a completely, ironclad ideology of exporting terror to the region. He's been developing. It's kind of the starting point from the Iranians during the negotiations, where they sort of sat down with the Americans and said, "Look, we just want to let you know we've enriched enough uranium to 60% that we now have capacity to build 11 nuclear bombs. We just think you should know." And which caused, of course, Trump hit the wall. He said, okay, F you, talks are over. We're going to send in the B-2s. And I'm not sure that was such a bad idea. You're dealing with somebody who has been terrorizing not just the near Middle East, but the world for more than 30 years. The biggest sponsor of state terrorism anywhere in the world. There was no negotiating with him. And I think now at least there's a hope that at some point you're going to get to people that are maybe not friendly the way we would like them, but maybe at least not as hostile as he was. Because it's hard to imagine anybody much more hostile than him. I mean, he was just categorically death to Israel, death to the UK, death to America, death to anybody, basically, who is not what he was.
But it's such an entrenched institution. They've been in power for whatever 40 years. It was 79. When was
but these things are still run by people. Those things are still run by people. But yes,
we will
you're not
see.
wrong. Absolutely. And it's not easy. I think what I would say is, and this is, back to us and our role in the world, the truth is Europe is watching from the sidelines. We were informed minutes before the strikes on a conflict that controls our energy supply. There's a split politically in Europe about what we should do. You had the same pattern with Russia and Ukraine. Russia attacks. We needed the U.S. U.S. We couldn't defend Ukraine without the U.S. At the time. U.S. can overthrow the regime in the Middle East. We're nowhere. And so, again, it's back to the thing we've been discussing so often. What is our role in the world? And, are we satisfied being bystanders to things that impact us to the extent they do?
I was looking at how much Qatar is going to be important for liquefied natural gas for Europe and the UK, and how that percentage is from whatever in the single digits up to 20% over the next decade. So obviously this is going to be an extremely important conflict. So we will see. Lomax, bring this back to Europe for us. Bring this back to what's going to stand on our doorsteps.
I think there's three things. One is around energy. One is around defense and defense micro supply chains. And three is around geopolitical points that Mads kind of touched on that also touches into sovereignty and defense, right? So the first one is energy. I think this again exposes our over-reliance on gas in the UK and Europe, which was massively exposed by Russia and is now exposed 4 years later. Mads just touched on some of the figures there. And the reason why we have so much reliance on gas is because we switched out, for climate reasons, we switched out of coal into gas, like fair enough. We still need gas to backstop the intermittent production from solar and wind, right? Because we don't have enough clean baseload power. So I think this throws up opportunities for startups, both like the deep infrastructure startups working at that kind of nuclear level, in terms of like founders building companies this is yet another exposure of that massive problem, right? And this is going to hit people in the pocket, because don't
And this
remember
isn't going anywhere, is it? This is going to be around for decades. This is not changing anytime soon.
We have a huge reliance on gas, right? And don't forget also that the way that electricity pricing works is that you price it when you call on gas as a last resort, because you've got less wind or less solar. You take the gas price and you apply that across the whole chain, right? Which means that it sets the price for the whole market. So as long as that that's a kind of structural way they structure electricity prices. But as long as that continues, when you have events like this, which have driven up gas prices by 70%, you're going to have like huge impacts on people's energy bills. And this then becomes a massive cost of living issue. So if you're founders building startups in, for example, nuclear, or energy, both either energy storage or energy power generation, you're going to be singing into singing to the ears of the politicians, right? And hopefully investors. And then I guess companies like Fuse Energy that are maybe working on the more consumer end as well. Like this kind of is a place that is going to be a good place to build companies, right? Massive investment is needed, right? The second one I think is a really interesting one, which is around defense supply chain. So these drones that the Iranians have been firing out, these like suicide kamikaze drones, the Shaheds, right? They cost, I think, 40,000, and they are being defended by the folks in the UAE, by Saudis, quite often with these Patriot missiles which cost millions. So
these are the Martyr drones, right?
Sorry,
these are the Martyr drones, right?
Yes, you've got them. Well, Martyr or kamikaze drones. Now, the Russians have their own equivalent, right? Which they've been using very effectively in Ukraine. Now, very interestingly, the Ukrainians, yes, the Russians licensed them. They licensed them from the Ukrainians, from the Iranians, and they call them, they have Gibran 2 and Gibran 3, right? Gibran 2 goes, I think, 100 kilometers an hour. Now, what the Ukrainians have developed, right? And this is why I want to use the term fast fashion. The supply chain for defense has moved from these big, long tail, heavy like artillery goods projects or complex systems to bootstrapped, nimble, agile, fast fashion type projects. And for example, what the Ukrainians have developed is a bunch of these interceptor drones, which cost a few K each, right? Which latch onto the Gibran 2s or the Shaheds, if you're an Iranian, these kamikaze drones, right? And that's how they've been defending themselves, right? And now there are like dozens of companies in Ukraine that have developed these. And why this is interesting is that the Middle Eastern countries are now talking about licensing that technology and spinning up production capability for those, rather than buying the millions of dollars of Patriot missiles from the Americans.
Because warfare
right?
has changed, right?
And also Zelensky is totally on board with this, because he's like, the more of like the cheap stuff that we can make or license to them and they can make, there's only so many like Patriot missiles in the world or delivery systems, like they can save them for us who really, really need them, right? So it's a really interesting to see. And I mentioned it last time, which is that Ukraine has become this hub of R&D for the next generation of defense. You're now seeing it actually applied into warfare and conflicts in other areas, right? So you're seeing that actually being applied now. So I think, and I talked about Ukraine becoming the kind of R&D hub. One of the benefits of the conflict is that Europe actually, in trying to build a sovereign defense capability, now has that capability in-house. In fact, they're better at it than the Americans, for example, right? And so, the Americans are now looking to license. I think that's a very, very interesting thing that's come up as a result of this. The final point is geopolitical one that Mads touched on. It's a couple of things which do play into, I think, just business building generally in Europe, right? It's like, look at what's going on with Spain and not letting the US use their air bases. And this is the problem with Europe, where you have like almost the lowest common denominator in terms of like, there's no single coherent foreign diplomatic policy that Europe has compared to like for example, the US. And I think that's a major, major problem because, you have Spain saying they do want to do, the Europeans feel like they have to back up Spain. And then also we need to kind of be close to the US. So I think it makes it very, very difficult. And the final point just on the geopolitics of this, which ties into defense and defense investing and defense R&D and startups, which is that basically, as Mads said, Europe has basically no direct military leverage in the region. They don't have a single foreign policy. Our main geopolitical tools in Europe are trade power, sanctions, regulatory influence, and diplomacy, right? And actually, when you have crises like this, without a kind of big stick, Europe is just alienated. And it's the second biggest economy in the world, one of the biggest trading blocs, and we haven't got a seat at the table. And everyone has a different opinion of this. It's freaking crazy, and it affects key supply chains for critical stuff. So it's just yet another wake up call about the inability of Europe to stand on its own 2 feet. I mean, look, we're now seeing a ton of investment go into this area, but it's just yet another example of that.